This is Hashtag Gen Z, a podcast that explores Generation Z, who they are, how they're different from other generations, while also being an incredible blend of those who came before them. We explore what they think is cool, what moves them, and why they do what they do. I'm your host, Megan Grace. Welcome back. It is always so fun when we get to hang out like this. We're going to go back for a second and really think about when I got into generational research. I truly never thought that I would be exploring the dating lives of young adults and teenagers, but understanding generations requires understanding how relationships occur and how people connect. So here we are. And let me tell you, it is fascinating. We are really going to get into what's going on in the dating lives of Gen Z because it feels more complicated than ever. And truthfully, it is. Ask young people today who are trying to navigate dating, romance, and partnership, and they'll give you the honest answer. A recent report by the Survey Center on American Life reveals that 47% of single Americans say it's hard to find people to date. The study also found that safety concerns and declining trust are reshaping modern dating, leaving many single people feeling pessimistic about their prospects. Today's episode is all about what is being called as the romantic recession, a data-driven look at how Gen Z is navigating dating, relationships, and identity in a world that's being more polarized, a deeper digital culture, and shifting gender dynamics. Today, my guest is Kelsey Eyre Hammond, who is a researcher and a program associate with the American Enterprise Institute's Survey Center on American Life. Her research focuses on social, cultural, and religious trends among Americans, including how those trends interact with politics. She's published a number of reports on dating, friendship, trust, and political opinion. We're talking about how politics influences romance, what the rise of dating apps really means, and why Gen Z's social landscape looks so different even from just a decade ago. It's thoughtful, it's surprising, and yes, there's even a shout out to second dates and awkward teenage moments. So let's get into it.
What happens when employees behave badly? Boy, we could do an entire TV show, maybe a Netflix special on that. Well, Ryan and I sat down and recorded episodes for FAMA, and we asked practitioners, give us your most outrageous story. You know, the sales leader that brings cocaine to work, whatever. Just bring us the outrageous, and it is funny. So if you need a laugh, which we all do from time to time, search for workplace misconduct wherever you get your podcast, and you'll find it. And trust me, you will laugh and cry, but you'll definitely laugh. All right. Thank you.
Welcome. I'm so excited for our guest today. We've got a great conversation planned, and it's going to be a really fun intersection of topics. Not only are we talking about a fresh new survey, but we're talking about some of the social life that goes on with Gen Z and what it's like for young people today. So I want to welcome my guest, Kelsey. Kelsey, welcome to the conversation.
Hi, it's so good to be here, Megan.
I'm excited to spend time with you today, nerd out about some data, and learn a little bit. So before we get into some of the great work that you and your colleagues have done, tell me a little bit about your professional background. How did you kind of get to the role that you're in today, and walk us through that journey of your professional work?
Of course. So yeah, I work at the American Enterprise Institute. I help manage the Survey Center on American Life. And I have been here for almost 3 years, just about 3 years now. Before coming to AEI, I was both in school and then I worked at a number of market research firms doing survey research as well. There were a couple different ones, one that I interned at and one that I worked at full time after graduating college. And yeah, so most of that work was all kind of client based and survey market research, which was really interesting. But pivoting here to AEI was able to allow me to kind of do more sociology based research that was, not for a specific client. So it kind of allows for a little bit more, freedom in what we're looking at and stuff like that, which is really interesting. I studied political science and Chinese in my undergrad. And then while I was an undergrad, did a lot of work on kind of polling and survey research. So that kind of led me naturally into my work at AEI.
And I can imagine with studying something very different, like Chinese than American culture, there's probably just like an innate knack in your interest of doing some of this sociological kind of like 30,000 foot view type of work, whether or not you planned it that way. I love when people are multifaceted, kind of like the background that you're bringing to this conversation. And I just love being around people that also do like sociology type things where we're looking at society as a whole, right? Like I want to say like at that 30,000 foot view. And some people will be like, oh, that's so pie in the sky. But really it's important to understand like a climate. And that's very exciting for what we're going to talk about today. So you and your colleagues recently released a study earlier this year titled The Romantic Recession. Tell me about that. Just give me a little bit of background on this study, and maybe we'll talk about some of the key insights from that study.
Sounds great. So our study called Romantic Recession was sort of spurred. We did a study on dating a couple of years ago, just asking people like, their preferences in dating, what their red flags were, what their habits were like as well, if they used online dating, things like that. And that was in January of like 2023, I believe, when that came out. And so since then, we had kind of been thinking like, okay, we need to do an additional survey report that kind of gets at the increasing gender divide between men and women. Something that, I don't know if you've looked at any polling of young men and young women after this last election, there was a really large gap. AP Votecast actually reported a 16-point gap in voting for Donald Trump among young men and young women, with men being 16 points higher in their support for Trump than young women were. And so that kind of definitely, that whole thing plays a role in what we were looking at here with Romantic Recession. It's kind of figuring out the intersection between politics and how the politics of young men and young women have changed in recent years, as well as like just the way that men and women are interacting, whether that's online, in person, that kind of thing, and how all of those things kind of were pulled together to impact the way that men and women are dating and how their romantic relationships are being affected. So that was kind of the goal.
Yeah, so it's so funny you say that, like this drift, right? Like that we were seeing with, if we're going to use the gender binary for these, this conversation right now, we saw that in 2021 in our study as well, when we were looking politically at young people in the US and not even asking like, who are you going to vote for, but where people were politically leaning. And when we did break it down by Gen Z in the US, we were seeing this drift towards the right that was being led by young men. So when people were like, how did this happen? I was like, I don't know. We just kind of saw this happening 2 years ago. So it's always interesting for two survey nerds like yourself and myself to get together and be like, haha, we affirmed what we saw. But
yeah, unfortunately, we were right.
Unfortunately, and it's never like an I told you so, but it is kind of one of those like we've been keeping an eye on it kind of thing. Okay, Kelsey. So this study was fascinating. I loved reading it. I think there's a lot of really great insights in the work that y'all did. Give me some of your favorites. If you had to pick 3 or 4 of the insights that you think listeners absolutely need to like take to heart, take to mind, what would those be?
Okay, great question. One of the first things that pops into my mind is just kind of the way that dating apps play into the way that men and women are dating. There are tons and tons of people who are having success on dating apps, of course, but there are also a lot of ways where dating apps and social media kind of cause people to pull apart and be less interested in like leaning into natural forms of courtship that allow people to kind of make mistakes and like be vulnerable, if that makes sense. So that is based on just some data that we have that said that basically men and women, both young men and young women, were much less likely to go on a second date with somebody who they had met on a dating app if the date wasn't like perfect, So when we asked them, if you were introduced by a close friend or just any other friend or acquaintance, they were much more likely to say they would go on a second date with someone if a first date didn't go well, which I think is just kind of indicative of like a general, like, when you meet someone through friends or in sort of an organic setting, there's generally there's more accountability and there's kind of more skin in the game, whereas only 11% of single women were willing to go on a second date with someone they met on a dating app if it didn't go very well, which is completely understandable. Like, that's not to vilify them or anything like that. Why would you go on a second date with someone if it didn't go well, especially if they're just some random person, from the internet? So I thought that finding was interesting just because I think that dating apps fill a really important need for a lot of people, but I also think that the more and more we rely on apps instead of kind of organic interaction with people, there's just less accountability. We also, in other work besides this survey, we have also kind of seen, and like both on social media and anecdotally through qualitative work we've done, people are more likely to report like men they've meet on dating apps. Women are more likely to report men they meet on dating apps like doing something creepy or making them feel bad in some way, or like using kind of verbally abusive language, things like that. And so that's another piece, is that unfortunately dating apps do kind of remove a certain sense of accountability, whereas like somebody who met through a friend like is going to treat that person much better because they know they're in the same circle of friends and there's like accountability there. So I did think that that finding about willingness to, or not willingness not to not go on a date, second date with someone, was interesting, and important. So that was one of them. Do you have anything kind of to add to that before I?
So many things. And it's, I'll be the first, I'll be the first to say that my husband and I met on a dating app, and I'm glad we went on our second date because clearly we're married, but our first date was really short because I didn't look up the hours to the coffee shop we went to, and they closed early, and like, you just met this person. So like, we're not going to like stand in the parking lot at night after work. Right. So it's one of those things that I feel like when I hear people say like, oh, it didn't go perfectly, I'm like, were they like serial killer red flag, or was it just like the coffee shop closed early? Because I also believe like no one's really their best normal self on a first date. And that second date is so critical. And so I just think that finding of like only 11% of people would go on a second date again, or 11% of women would go on a second date if the first one wasn't like perfect. And I've told so many of my friends, like if they're on the apps, like if you were 50% sold, go again, because the second date you're probably gonna be more comfortable. And sure enough, like it does help. So I just thought that was so interesting, because I'm pretty sure that if I hadn't followed back up with my husband, we would not be married. So shout out to the second date.
That's such a good anecdote. I love that. I'm so happy for you guys that that you were able to push through the awkward first date.
And it wasn't awkward. It was the fact that I didn't check the hours, right? So like
you're like, sorry.
It wasn't bad. It was just potentially too short to like have a full guess on like if we really, really liked each other. Like there's no red flags, right? Like we're married, we got it, we're good. Okay, let's talk about some other stuff, because I think that the element of apps plays like a really big role with just how young people in Gen Z are interacting romantically, friend-wise, you name it, right? So like that's one kind of factor that's shaping some of the things that Gen Z is experiencing in the dating world. Let's talk about some of the perspective stuff from the study that you all did and how we're seeing that divide and kind of that the personal perspectives people are bringing into dating kind of shifting away and making it potentially a unique landscape for this generation of daters.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess hopefully this answers your question. This is just kind of something I'm thinking about. I think that men and women are increasingly, they differ a lot on like what their ideals for relationships, I think. So, for example, this is something we talk about a lot, is like this idea of masculinity and who, if it's important to men or important to women, or who it's important to. And, we actually found that college educated single men and college educated single women differ a lot on this, where college educated single women only 38% of college educated single women believe being masculine is important for a man to attract a woman, whereas 64% of college educated single men believe it's important. And so, that kind of, I think, indicates, I know we talk a lot about like the female gaze and the male gaze, like, like the different ideas of attractiveness for different people. But I thought that having that number was really interesting, that like it really, this group of people, college educated single men and college educated single women, who you would expect like these people are dating each other, have very different ideas of what's important. So, perhaps 64% of college educated single men are like trying so hard to be really masculine and macho because they believe that like that's important in attracting women, whereas like barely over a third of women who are in this dating pool for them feel that way. So I don't know. I think that that's really interesting. I think there tends to be a mismatch between men and women and kind of what they're looking for. Yeah.
I think that's such a not like a unique take, but I do think it is something to keep note of, right? Because what I'm hearing from that is if we're going to talk about like masculinity and like a potentially traditional definition of that, it sounds like women are more giving men more grace to express masculinity or express what it means to be a man in a greater, let's just say, variety of what that looks like than what men are saying is okay. Right. And like that matchup of gender expression, I could see how that could be a problem. Like I could see how
Totally.
if young men are like, this is the way that we need to be, but women are like, no, you can be all kinds of a man, like whatever, like whatever's emotionally healthy is what I'm hearing, is what's right. And I just wonder how like identity exploration of this generation at a younger age and like in a more nuanced way could be playing a part in that. I don't know. It's like, there's so many layers to some of the stuff that y'all have been looking at. And I just think it's fascinating.
No, absolutely. And honestly, like, I feel like some of the downside of survey research is that it's so hard to, and you already know this, I'm sure, but like find causal mechanisms to where we're like, oh, this is so interesting that this is happening. We don't totally know why, but like we can theorize and ask follow-up questions and, try to get a good sense of why something's happening. But it is hard for us to find causal mechanisms, unfortunately. But I think that your theory is spot on, where I think that generally we also see young women are just quite a bit more ideologically liberal than young men. And so I think their understandings of like gender roles and things like that are probably far more progressive than young men's are.
I agree with you. And that's like similarly in your work, in my line of work, our overlap is like, I wouldn't want to say like our Venn diagram is a circle, but the idea of, it's damn near impossible to talk about like causal inference when it comes to things at the 30,000 foot view, because we're not doing experimental design because it's deeply unethical. And so we're doing a lot of speculative or let's just say triangulative types of inference, right? So like in my case, like I would be like, this is what I'm saying here, here, and here. So maybe from like our dating and romance friends, our census friends, our gender expression researchers, and blending all that together to understand like from a generational perspective, very similarly to how you're kind of like, we can't causally think about this, right? Like, because we can't put people in little control groups to see if this is experimental. And I think that's like something that a lot of people get wrong with sociology and get wrong with like social sciences in general, is like how hard it is to prove causality. But some of it's just like, I don't know, trust your gut and your observations. That's also part of it. I would love to talk a little bit more about the practicality of all of this, right? So like we could talk about the 30,000 foot view. What do you think are some of the things in terms of factors that are shaping specifically that Gen Z dating scene? We talked about apps being one of them. We talked about kind of like gender understanding and expression being another. What do you think are some of the other factors that is influencing the landscape that Gen Z is navigating when we're thinking about dating and romance?
So I think unfortunately, and I've in addition to the survey work that we've done, we've also done a lot of qualitative work. So we've done some focus groups, we've done some interviews with different Gen Zers of various ages within Gen Z, college students, et cetera. And so kind of marrying that together with the data that we have, something that I've noticed is that a lot of Gen Zers, I've talked to a lot of like seniors in college who have never really had a romantic relationship. They've gone on dates, they've, maybe done like some hooking up here and there, but like they haven't really had like a relationship. And a lot of them thought, they're 22, they're seniors in college. They're like, I kind of thought I would have had like a boyfriend or, something like that. And a lot of them seem to be like lacking that experience in a way that it doesn't seem millennials and Gen Xers lacked that experience. And I think a lot of that might have to do with the pandemic. It has to do with like just decreased socialization and the increase of kind of like phone-based adolescence. But another big thing, there are a number of things that are a little scary about that. And one of them being that the average age of a first date for Gen Zers. So I'm looking at one of the charts in our report right now, and we asked people their average age of their first date as well as their average age of seeing their first pornographic video. So video specifically, not like just a picture. And Gen Zers, their average age of their first date was around 16 years old, whereas their average age of seeing their first pornographic video was around 14 years old. So the numbers are 13.9 and then 16.7. So yeah, around 14 and 17 years old. And so that the fact that Gen Zers are seeing pornography more regularly and it's more accessible and earlier than they're actually experiencing like going on dates and like having those relationships is somewhat alarming. If you look at baby boomers, for example, their average age of their first date was around the same time as Gen Zers, but their first time seeing a pornographic video was on average when they were in their early 20s. And so a lot of those people had probably already had their own sexual experiences, had probably already dated quite a bit, and so they might have many, sociologists and psychologists would theorize that people who have already had those experiences IRL are maybe more suited to interpret and understand what they're seeing when they see a pornographic video and understand if it's real or not, or if it's, like how they should apply that to their lives. Whereas you're seeing a lot more Gen Zers who are not having those experiences, but they are having them virtually. And so that kind of creates a warped perception of, how romantic relationships should work, of how sexuality should work. You see an increase in people subscribing to and paying for OnlyFans. And that also adds an element of transaction, like makes it kind of transactional. Sorry, that was kind of a weird way of saying that, but adds an element of transaction to romantic relationships. And that it's pretty like messy, I would say. And so that's kind of something like when I look at the landscape of Gen Zers, dating, that's one of the worries I have. And I myself am a Gen Zer, but I look especially at the second half of Gen Z, the younger half of Gen Z, and I think that it's kind of worrisome to think that like they have perhaps created an idea of what their sexual life should look like before they've actually had the chance to have any kind of a romantic relationship with anyone.
Absolutely. I mean, that is, again, we're talking about things that we didn't think would be cause and effect or related. We're not going to say they're causal, but they're definitely linked, right? I think just about anybody that can understand the difference between like a real life relationship and what goes on in a pornographic medium, whatever that looks like for an individual, is not always, that does not simulate real life. It is it's a different reality. But if that is the socialization that's occurring first, that does set the precedent of like what etiquette looks like. And I think that your assessment, it is worrisome. Like we know that there are some aspects of pornographic media that is like deeply troubling around things like consent, safety, power dynamics, like you name it. And we do see that trickle like into my world of like higher ed when we're talking about student safety and student consent and like the fact that students are going to hook up and like, is it a safe and an empowering environment or is it an unsafe experience? And so that what I'm hearing is those social interactions are really critical for young people, even if it is just a high school date or two, to go on them. Like to do that, to get out there and practice those skills, even if it's not the love of your life kind of thing. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about what can we do with all this, right? We have some Gen Z listeners who are probably like, please tell me, what do I do with this? What can Gen Zers or those who potentially have Gen Zers in their life that they support, how can they take some of these insights and potentially have a more positive and productive dating experience?
I think that, I don't know, in my mind, the answer is a little bit like, unfortunately, you have to push yourself through uncomfortable situations. Not like uncomfortable because of safety, but like awkward, I think it's important. A lot of young people I've talked to have been like, oh, like I'm scared to talk to this person, so like I'm just gonna like stay home and like then they'll scroll on their phone for 3 hours or, something like that. I think that that's like pretty common, is that like there's a good amount of social anxiety. A lot of Gen Zers were in high school when the pandemic happened, which really kind of unfortunately hindered, I think, a lot of like adolescent, growing up and like kind of experiencing things that are uncomfortable but cause you to have better social skills. I don't know. I graduated high school in 2015 and I felt like, okay, yeah, like there were countless times when I was in high school where I said or did something awkward, had to deal with some social anxiety, and then like became more eloquent and more socially adept because of that, And so I think that that's unfortunately the answer might just be that like anyone who's fearing their ability to connect with people just has to push themselves to do that more. It's easier for some people. It's easier for extroverts. It's easier for, people who grew up in very social communities and things like that. But I do think that tends to be a big part of it, is like the people who are more social are going to have an easier time dating. If you know more people, you have more friends, it's easier. Another thing that we find is that like another report we did talked a lot about how attending college just increases your social capital and your social network just drastically. And when we talk about, like in the US, we talk a lot about the loneliness epidemic. And this is a big thing we talk about in the spaces in sociology kind of spaces like we're in right now. We talk about this loneliness epidemic. And really, when you look at it, people who went to college are not experiencing the loneliness epidemic in the same way that people who didn't, are. And that's kind of an unfortunate truth. I think people who were non-college educated, their social connectors used to be their churches and their communities, and people who didn't go to college are increasingly less and less likely to be attending churches and things like that now, which means that they need to find different avenues for social connectedness. So leaning into your communities, talking to your neighbors, like all those things. If you're not going to go to college, you just have to maybe you have to be a little bit more intentional about building community around you, because if you do go to college, there's a good chance that that community will be built organically. And it's a lot harder if you don't.
I appreciate you bringing up you need to be awkward in high school, because you do. I don't know why. It's just like very Kismet that we're talking about this. Like, I was laying in bed the other day and I was like about to fall asleep and I was like, remember that weird thing I said in my sophomore year? It flashed back to me. And I was like, I'll never do that again. And I was also like, you're never going to be a sophomore dating ever again. So yeah, you will never say that. But it's so true. It's the trial, the error, the practice of it all. And if I'm hearing anything in terms of the takeaways that Gen Z listeners and those who support Gen Z is maybe we use the app or we use the technology to make the date and then we just go on the date. But maybe we start with I don't want to say training wheels versions, but lower stakes. Is it a coffee and a walk? Is it going for an ice cream, right? It's not huge financial or time capital, but it's probably something you were going to do anyways. And so I think sometimes people are like, oh, but it's a date. They need to be taking me out for a really nice dinner. And I was like, but do you want to be stuck for an hour and a half with someone? Maybe not. Do the practice reps, right? And so put the phone down, get to know the people, even our introverted friends. It can be a place where that's necessary. It's finding the spaces where you feel most comfortable. And I do think we're seeing more and more Gen Z young people gravitating towards that offline connection and organizing events that probably in the past we wouldn't have needed to organize. I keep seeing reading events popping up in the city that I live in, where it's just bring your book, and then there's moments of social time built in. So they do 30-minute rotations, right? To me, I'm that feels very up Gen Z's alley of okay, you're going to read your book, be around people, and then you can opt into the socialization for 30 minutes if you want to, right? I'm if you were a single book lover, that is your time to shine and go find someone. And I think I think that we're seeing some of these more organic places that might open up the door for that. But I really appreciate the insights that you've brought into this conversation around we got to keep an eye on some of the stuff. And we need to encourage young people to have those healthy relationships. And it's just interesting that this study was really inspired by kind of that drift that we saw in the election, because I do think that if we want to bring it back around, there's ripple effects that are going to occur with this current trend in, let's just say, coupling or non-coupling of people, right? From your perspective, how have some of the insights and findings from this study started to make you all think about how the current trend right now is going to have impacts on other aspects of Gen Z's life down the road?
That's a great question. There's also a lot of research. I think there's some research actually from Pew that talks about where they ask people about their desire to have children. And I think that kind of, I think if people don't want to get married and have children, then this doesn't really matter, if they don't, then people Gen Zers, the romantic recession, if people don't want that, then I guess that doesn't matter. I'm sure there are long-term sociological impacts of people not getting married and having children, obviously, but it's not my job to tell individuals what they should or shouldn't want. But there is kind of most of the people that I've talked to, and the majority of Gen Zers, still do want to get married and have children. That is a goal that they have. And so if that is a goal that they have, then these kind of roadblocks of okay, if you're a young liberal woman and you want to have children and the majority of the men you're interacting with are Trump supporters and that's a deal breaker for you, then that's a huge roadblock to your life goals, you know? And so that's kind of something that I think that it's important to consider is like, do Gen Zers still have these goals? And like, how will these differences among men and women like impact those? Because I think that it is hard enough to find a partner who is like good and loving and will be the type of partner that you want. And when you add on this like increased political polarization between men and women, it gets even harder, you know? And so I think that's definitely something that people need to consider. And I think the rhetoric sort of needs to change too. I think a lot of times people talk about, you know, oh, none of these young women like want to get married. They all just like want to have cats and like they just like don't want to have kids and like they need to have kids. And you know, you hear people talking like that about Gen Z women, and it's really not accurate and it's not helpful because most Gen Z women still want to have traditional lifestyles. They still want to have children. Not saying that they want to like quit their jobs and only raise kids and have chickens, but like they do most young women do want to eventually have children. And so acting as though like vilifying young women for resisting sort of a patriarchal marital structure is not really helpful.
Absolutely. And I there's such a parallel to that too of what I hear, like of the vilification of young people, like not wanting to work in traditional corporate settings and corporations getting upset that young people don't want to be abused by corporate settings. Does that make sense? Like I hear all the time of like bosses being like, nobody wants to work today. Nobody wants to put in the hours that they need to be successful. No one wants to pretty much sacrifice their whole life and happiness to work here. And I think that I hear the same thing. And I want to say exactly what I want to say to those men, what I would say to those bosses. Maybe they don't want to work for you. It's not that they don't want it. They don't want to work for you. And that's hard to hear. And I'm not going to be like, they're the same people saying that, because that's not exactly it. But it's the same kind of mindset of the vilification of young people having the same goals, but refusing to play the game with the old rules.
Totally. And I think that there's opportunity. Like, I think that if you are like a young man who has a nuanced view of the world and like is interested in understanding the women who you're dating and is interested in being a good partner, then like you should have a lot of options, you know, like that. And like that is great, you know. So I do think that like there's hope in that. It just takes a lot of intentionality, honestly, and it takes a lot of like thinking about, okay, what do I want and like what am I willing to do to get there? Because I do think a lot of young men complain that they don't feel like, you know, women like them. They feel like they get rejected a lot. That was another piece of data in our survey here, that like men are experiencing rejection at really high rates. And I mean, I think that it's important for everybody, men and women who are dating, to think introspectively about what they want and how their actions are aligning with that, you know. And if you are getting rejected, like that is sad, and it's important for women to empathize with that way that men are dealing with that. And it's also important for men to empathize with the other struggles that women are dealing with and not like just vilify the other side, because there's a lot of that. And I think that's what's unfortunately not very productive. And it's not going to lead to people getting the outcomes that they want.
And I agree with you. I think that there is even this gap of like empathy practice from both sides of it, right? And so like, yeah, it's hard to be rejected time and time again, but like introspection helps to understand why we might be rejected. And either way of that, I mean, I'm always going to be like the girls, right? Like fight for the girls. But like young women are also feeling like in a way rejected because their priorities are being told it doesn't matter as much. You just need to change. And so we're going to have this kind of like impasse and like this bumping of heads for a really long time. I think unless there is that development of empathy, and I don't necessarily, that doesn't mean like, hey, everyone change your ways so we can all get along and we can be like a procreative society. That's not what I'm trying to say. I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with standing up for your values, while also trying to be empathetic to somebody else's perspective. Again, that takes practice. Like that takes the socialization of being like, just because someone says something differently than me or thinks differently doesn't mean they're a bad person. I should write them off entirely. Like that's hard. Okay, Kelsey, you have given us so much to think about, so much to talk about. And I do believe that we could keep talking about this for a long time. There's just so much in that study to unpack, which I'm going to put the study in the show notes for anyone that wants to kind of do the deep dive and read the stats. But before we go, Kelsey, I want to know, what's your favorite thing about working with Gen Z and studying Gen Z and really being able to examine the behaviors of your peers?
I just think that the world that Gen Zers has grown up in has been very complicated. I mean, I obviously am biased because that is the world that I grew up in. But I think that the world that Gen Zers have grown up in has thrown a lot at them. And I think, unfortunately, I think that this is true of every youngest generation. It was true when millennials were the youngest generation. It was probably true when Xers were the youngest generation. There's a tendency to think, oh, the young people are just like so terrible. And I really like kind of fighting for and you know, representing in a way, and also just sort of, sorry, what's the word, like defending Gen Zers, because I do think that there's so many Gen Zers who do have like really nuanced opinions about things and really think critically about the world around them, and they are interested in making the world better, and they're interested in having full and happy lives. And so I like enjoy kind of observing the trends among Gen Zers, because I think they should get a little more credit than some want to give them. And that's fun for me.
If anyone's going to give them credit, it's me. I'm a big believer in making sure that every generation is playing nice with everybody else. But that is, I think I love the point that you brought up of like, they still want to live like happy and productive lives and fulfilled lives. And that's one of the things that people think, that with generations, like the human brain has evolved so much that like young people don't want that anymore. No, they do. They're just trying to do it in a completely different world. And they still want, again, happy and fulfilling lives. They want companionship. They want friendship. They want relationships that are meaningful. They're just navigating it in a very different space. And sometimes I think older generations miss that a little bit. So we got to keep speaking up for Gen Z and any generation that finding your person is not the easiest thing to do, regardless of what generation you're in. We just have different and new challenges in today's world. Well, Kelsey, it has been fantastic to learn with you. And I'm sure people want to follow along and know a little bit more about your work and the work that you are doing. What is the best way that people can follow along and learn more about the great work you all are doing?
Great cue. So they can find our website at americansurveycenter.org. And that's where you can find basically all of our work, all of our news mentions, stuff like that. They can also find me and my coworkers on Twitter. Our Survey Center and American Life Twitter account is at AmerSurvey STR Center. And then my personal Twitter is at KLEHSHEY. It's a little funky. It's Kleshi, which is kind of a weird handle and not doing me any favors. But yeah.
That's great. You threw Twitter at me and I was like, whoa, we're still doing that one. But
oh yeah, sorry, X.
Oh, we're X now. So if that's,
I forgot. I have never called it X in my life. So
I for a second, I hadn't used it in so long that I kind of forgot what we were calling it. So it's there. But that's, if you need to find Kelsey, that's where she is. But there's a lot of great insight in the study you did. Congratulations. I know firsthand how nice it is to get the insights out into the world. And we hope we can get some more people heading over there and learning with y'all. But thank you again, Kelsey. It's been fantastic to chat with you today.
I want to take a break real quick just to let you know about a new show we've just added to the network. Up Next at Work, hosted by Gene and Kata Keel of the Devon Group. Fantastic show. If you're looking for something that pushes the norm, pushes the boundaries, has some really spirited conversations, Google Up Next at Work, Gene and Kata Keel from the Devon Group.
Kelsey brought the data and the heart to this conversation, and you know how much I love that. We covered a lot of great data insights and examples from the AEI survey, but here are a few key takeaways that I hope you take with you. First, there's no surprise here. Dating dynamics are shifting expectations because of the use of apps. When connections lack organic roots, like shared friends or common connections, there's often less accountability and less willingness to give things a second shot. Second, Gen Z's gender and political divide is real, and it's shaping the dating pool. Young women and men aren't just mismatched in values, they're sometimes playing by completely different rules when it comes to identity and partnership. Another thing is that early exposure to digital intimacy may be replacing real-life experience, creating new challenges around socialization, consent, and emotional connection. And honestly, so what can we do with all of this? If you're a member of Gen Z, keep practicing the social reps, even the awkward ones. The more time we spend connecting with others allows for important social skill building that is needed to engage in meaningful and trusting relationships long term. If you're someone that's supporting Gen Z, help them build the offline spaces that spark connection and encourage them to go on the date they might think is awkward or might not pan out. If you want to dive deeper, you can find all the details about the romantic recession study linked in the show notes. As always, thank you for tuning in. If this conversation resonated with you, please be sure to share it with a friend, a colleague, a family member, and so we can keep that conversation going. Rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts is also a great way to help others find hashtag Gen Z so they can learn along with us. But I hope you've been enjoying the season so far. There are more great conversations on the way, so subscribing is the best way to make sure that you don't miss any new episodes when they become available. If you think I'm missing someone or a topic that we just haven't covered yet, please head to my website and fill out a form that'll get sent to me. You can share your thoughts using the form at meganmgrace.com/podcast. If you want to stay connected on social media, you can find me on Instagram and LinkedIn at Megan M. Grace. This episode was edited by Leah Kramer, the Gen Zer behind the scenes who really does bring this podcast to life. But thank you all for stopping by. Let's continue this conversation, and we'll chat soon.